Good morning everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all on behalf of my organisation, Historic Royal Palaces, particularly to Kensington Palace for this three-day conference, Making of a Monarchy for the Modern World. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. I know that we have delegates who are here from America, from Thailand, from New Zealand and Australia, so a particular welcome to you, to the UK, in what's a very special year for us, as we've all seen in the celebrations over the weekend. We at Historic Royal Palaces are proud to be hosting this conference. This is the second such event that we've organised. The first was in 2009 at Hampton Court Palace, marking the 500th anniversary of Henry VIII's accession to the throne. For those for whom this is your first contact with us, Historic Royal Palaces is responsible for the Tower of London, Hampton Court Palace, Kensington Palace, Kew Palace and the Banqueting House at Whitehall. We're an independent charity and we receive no money at all from the government. In caring for these great national assets, our cause, as we describe it, is very simple. We help everyone explore the story of how monarchs and people have shaped society in some of the greatest palaces ever built. I'm proud of our reputation for being able both to find many ways, often highly original, to generate wide public engagement with our palaces and their stories, and also to carry out an active academic research programme and to host conferences like this. Our stated ambition to become recognised formally and nationally as an independent research organisation with all that means is a mark of our commitment at this level. The conference will explore the making of the modern British monarchy through a programme of 45 papers covering the period from the Glorious Revolution to the present day. The papers cover an exceptionally wide range of subjects. The Queen's role as head of the Commonwealth through to royal hats, from Queen Victoria on screen through Napoleon through to the modern British monarchy. Your role over the next 3 days will be to discuss and debate how the British monarchy has evolved and adapted to survive, indeed flourish, in the modern age. We hope and expect challenging debate, new knowledge and fresh insights. We began planning this conference in 2010. We knew that 2012 would be a very important year for Historic Royal Palaces as an organisation, and especially for this palace, Kensington. In March, we reopened the palace after a major redevelopment that took 3 years and cost over £12 million. Visitors to the palace now approach it through a new landscape and garden and a new entrance. They can now explore the restored and represented interiors of the King's and the Queen's state apartments, visit a new permanent narrative exhibition called Victoria Revealed on the life of Queen Victoria, who was born and learned that she would be Queen here. They can see temporary exhibitions on Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee and the role of Diana, Princess of Wales, as fashion leader. Diana, of course, was another notable royal resident here. They can enjoy the new courtyards, shops and cafes. And in the Claw Learning Centre, we have provided new education and community facilities with a team to run our programmes. It was our aim to open up the buildings and gardens and increase our visitors' appreciation of the momentous events that have occurred here. To hold this conference at the Palace seemed like a highly appropriate way to celebrate the new Kensington Palace. 2012 is also an important year for Historic Royal Palaces, as the nation has been celebrating the Diamond Jubilee of Her Majesty the Queen. At this significant milestone, it seems appropriate to look back over the last 3 centuries and to reassess how Britain ended up with a constitutional monarchy that shows no sign of weakening or disappearing. Indeed, it seems stronger than ever. This conference is an opportunity to reflect on the longevity, durability and adaptability of Britain's monarchy. In this respect, Kensington is again a very fitting location. The palace was bought by William III and Mary II shortly after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, one of the most significant moments of constitutional change and a milestone in the making of the modern monarchy. When we began to consider the programme for the conference, we felt it was important to represent both the political development of the monarchy, its global reach and changing relationship with the Empire and Commonwealth, and also the modern monarchy as reflected in film, theatre, the media, through material culture and dress. As Kensington Palace is home to the Royal Ceremonial Dress Collection, royal and court dress in particular is an important theme in the conference programme. Each day of the 3 days will start with a plenary lecture delivered by one of our 3 distinguished keynote speakers, Professor Sir David Cannadine from Princeton University, Professor Maya Yazanov from Harvard University, and Professor Emeritus Eileen Ribeiro from the Courtauld Institute of Art. After which the papers will run in 2 parallel strands, one exploring the political and constitutional development of monarchy, and one considering monarchy and culture. You'll also be able to enjoy the cultural history of the palace at the conference gala dinner on Thursday night, and a concert with music specially organised by Oliver Davis, and tours of the newly displayed palace this evening. We also wanted to make this conference accessible to students working in the field. To do this, we've awarded bursaries to 10 postgraduate students working on the history of the monarchy. 2 of these, which were awarded to students working on dress history, have been generously funded by Maney Publishing through the Costume Society. Now, can I ask all students receiving bursaries to show hands, please? Okay, so take a look at these very special people and make them feel especially welcome at this conference. You're all very welcome particularly. Finally, may I record my thanks, and I'm sure yours too, to all the Historic Royal Palaces team who've worked so hard to get us all to this point. And especially a few names that I would like to mention: Joanna Marshner, Deirdre Murphy, Alexandra Kim, Sarah Levine, Lucy Worsley, all the KP functions and events teams, to all the contributors for what they're about to do, and a very special appreciation, leaving most important person to last, to HRP's Olivia Fryman as the lead organiser at our end. So I wish you all a very successful conference. Have a great 3 days here at Kensington, and I'd now like to introduce you to Lucy Worsley, Chief Curator at Historic Royal Palaces, to get things underway. Thank you, Lucy.
Good morning. Now, in some respects, Kensington Palace is rather an unlucky place to live, if you remember, of the royal family. In 1694, Mary II died here of smallpox. She was only 32. In her bedroom, which is currently being used as a collections store. One day, we hope to open this up to visitors. In 1702, William III took his last breath on the window seat of the King's Gallery, where we'll be having our dinner tomorrow night. And in 1760, George II also died at Kensington Palace on the water closet of a heart attack, just like Elvis. Unfortunately, we can't show you the exact spot of that one, because the curators can't agree on which floor the water closet is located. More positively, it was at Kensington in 1819 that the insignificant-looking little baby princess who would become Queen Victoria was born. Maid of Teck, the future Queen Mary, grew up here, and it was the starter home for the married lives of Princess Margaret and Diana, Princess of Wales, and of course it will fulfil the same function for the next generation. So we have a rich, dense clot of royal stories here. Fun and the games and the beautiful objects and the royal biographies that you'll see unfold as you go around Kensington Palace. There is a kind of intellectual scaffolding of monarchy as an institution. As you'll learn on your tour later on, the 4 new routes or displays are devoted respectively to each of 4 centuries of constitutional. The Queen's apartments of the late 17th century tell the story of William and Mary, builders of the palace, Anne's reproductive failures and the arrival of the Hanoverians. The second story, The King's Apartments, explores the period of Kensington's greatest political significance, when George I rebuilt the state apartments as a stage for entertaining, and George II and Queen Caroline had the use of them after his death. The rooms where Queen Victoria grew up tell the story of her early life, which led to the formation of her character and her queenship. And the current small Diana display gives a glimpse of the 20th century monarchy that we're going to build upon next year in a bigger and more permanent exhibition. 2 years ago, we decided that this reopening of the palace would be a good opportunity to bring together historians and scholars to reflect on the themes that you can really only nod towards in a display intended for visitors. 2 years ago, Holger Hook sat here and I met up in a Lebanese restaurant, as I remember, and we sketched out the form that this conference would take. I'm very grateful to Holger for that. He was the founding member of our academic advisory panel who selected the papers. The other members are sitting around the room. We have Hannah Gregg, we have Joanna Marshner, Alexandra Kim, and Philip Warren for the Costume Society as well. I'm grateful to all of them. But practically the first thing that Holger said was that we needed to involve David Cannadine. And we really only knew that our conference could work when he agreed to take part. He's currently the Whitney J. Oates Senior Research Scholar at Princeton University, as well as Honorary Professor at the University of London. And I have to say that The Decline and Fall of the British Aristocracy, David, was the first ever history book that I bought with my own pocket money. Class and culture and ceremony and national memory and the teaching of history are all his areas of expertise. And he's also generous with his time in getting involved, not just in academic history, but in public history. He's long been a commentator on contemporary events. He was on the BBC yesterday, and the general conclusion was that they should have got him in for Sunday too. I have to tell you that on Twitter yesterday, someone started a hashtag called Cannadine Love. Over the weekend, I was looking again into his collected journalism, History in Our Time, which is full of insights into the changing nature of monarchy in the 20th century. Personally, I particularly like the way that his writing is full of fireworks and pyrotechnics, as well as expressing his big ideas. He has all kinds of little tricks and puns and jokes that he hides within it. David is the chairman or the trustee of numerous institutions. I'll mention just the National Portrait Gallery. You can read about the others in your programme. And he was knighted in 2009 for services to education. For us, this morning, he's going to grasp the nettle of constitution, explaining what it is, given that we don't actually have a written constitution. He's going to take us through the process of monarchy becoming constitutional and explore today whether it's been feminised or emasculated or a little bit of both. There will be a little time at the end, we hope, for questions. So we're very, very pleased to welcome the monarchy's most distinguished historian to open our conference, David Cannadine.
I'm supposed to be addressing the question of when and how did the British monarchy become a constitutional monarchy. And we're doing so, of course, off the back of the Diamond Jubilee, only the second Diamond Jubilee celebrated in this country, and as I'm sure you all know, only 5 Diamond Jubilees have been celebrated in modern times, 2 in Britain, 1 in Austria-Hungary, 1 in Japan, and 1 in Thailand. So there's something particularly unique about the fact that Britain, unlike any other country, has had 2 of them. You can't have a Diamond Jubilee without a monarchy. That, I think, is pretty obvious. And monarchy has not been a growth industry over the last 110 years. Most of the monarchies that have gone have been authoritarian: Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, China. The monarchies that have survived have been much less so, or have been forced to become much less so. Scandinavia, the Low Countries, Spain and Japan, and especially Great Britain. And one of the themes that is constantly explored in regard to that is the difference between monarchs that rule and monarchs that reign. And the argument that's often made is that it's the monarchs that reign that have been more successful in surviving than the monarchs that rule. And we tend to equate the concept of constitutional monarchy with monarchs that reign but don't rule. And we also tend to suppose that Britain is the place where this concept of monarchy was pioneered and is most fully developed. In fact, it was a term first used in the 1800s by the French, rather surprisingly, since nobody, I think, would describe the pre-1789 French monarchy in those terms, or the upstart regime of Napoleon of the 1800s either. And it was popularised in this country by Macaulay in his History of England during the 1850s. This is what Macaulay wrote. According to the pure idea of constitutional royalty,
The prince reigns but does not govern. And constitutional royalty, as it now exists in Britain, comes nearer than in any other country to that pure idea. That's what Macaulay wrote in his History of England in the 1850s, suggesting, which is the widely held view, I think, and has been ever since, that Britain was the prototypical constitutional monarchy, the first to get there and the longest to practice this particular form of royal endeavour in politics and public life. Of course, it is rather ironic, partly for the reason that Lucy has given. If you haven't got a written constitution, how can you ever be either constitutional or unconstitutional if you don't quite know what the constitution is or looks like or what the rules are? Alternatively, it's ironic, perhaps because it might be easier to evolve towards a constitutional monarchy if you actually have no constitution written down at all. And those general thoughts are ones that we might want to play with and tease our minds with in the course of the next 3 days. I'm going to address a more specific set of questions. How did the British monarchy become a constitutional monarchy? When did it become a constitutional monarchy? Who wanted it to become a constitutional monarchy? And perhaps more importantly, in a way, who didn't want it to become a constitutional monarchy? And I want to try and play with those questions, if I may, and in accordance with the general coverage of this conference, I'm going to take as long a view as I can plausibly do, though not, I'm afraid, as long a view as merit. I'm going to look at 3 phases, from 1760 to 1837, from 1837 to 1901, and from 1901 to the present day. Now, you'll notice that I've chopped up the periodisation reign by reign because we tend to think about monarchy like that. But one of the things that I'm going to argue here is that we shouldn't keep thinking about monarchy like that because the phases of evolution don't actually fit exactly with the reigns of monarchs, as I'll try to show. Can I start then by looking at 1760 to 1837, and I'll begin, if I may, with a story. The first essay I ever wrote as an undergraduate in Cambridge was an attempt to answer the following question. Who was responsible for the ministerial instability of the 1760s? George III, John Wilkes, or Sir Lewis Mania? A question which, of course, it is completely impossible to answer, and therefore a question that has remained with me ever since. One of the books that I was asked to read in order to write this impossible-to-write essay was a book edited by an American scholar, E.A. Rightan, with the title George III, Tyrant or Constitutional Monarch. Well, in fact, he was neither, but it's quite an interesting way to set the issue up. If we start in 1760, as for purposes of convenience and brevity I want to do, we need to remember that the monarchy as it then existed was, in some senses, a parliamentary creation. That's to say, if we think of the Restoration, if we think of the Glorious Revolution, and if we think of the Act of Settlement, it was Parliament which determined the terms on which monarchs reigned and which particular person should be reigning as monarch. Parliament, in that sense, was actually in charge. Whatever some monarchs might think, in practice they no longer ruled by divine right, they ruled by the fiat of Parliament. Not surprisingly, as a result of that, from the early 1700s on, they no longer vetoed legislation sent up from Parliament, and of course, since the 17th century, if not before, they're depending on parliamentary authorisation for taxation and for finance. Now, put another way, what that meant was that by the time George III became king in 1760, he was involved in something which was ambiguously called limited monarchy or a mixed constitution. Not written down, a combination of customs and conventions and precedents, the envy of many other nations, and of course, in fact, the model for the American Constitution later on, even if they had been rebelling against the British. One of the themes, one of the customs, one of the conventions of this mixed constitution and limited monarchy was the notion that the king could do no wrong. And the king did no wrong because he didn't govern. It was the ministers who governed in his name, and they were the ones who were responsible for the consequences of such policies as they had invoked and taken up. Moreover, these ministers were first and foremost responsible to Parliament, especially the Commons, because without the support of Parliament, they couldn't raise money and they couldn't govern. However, at the same time, those ministers were also responsible to the monarch, who appointed them and who could dismiss them, and who was responsible for allowing Parliament to be dissolved for general elections. And And in that, as it were, sense of divided loyalty to a minister responsible to Parliament or ministers responsible to the monarch, it was from that sense of divided loyalties that there was a long period of uncertainty and, in a sense, a trial of strength between the monarch and the politicians. And there was, of course, no Supreme Court to determine how the Constitution could be interpreted. It simply had to be worked by trial and error to see what happened. Now, it's important to notice that George III did have a very strong view of what, within this limited system, the royal prerogative actually was. Lewis Napier famously sought to argue that the constitutional conduct of George III differed not at all from that of George I or George II. John Brewer, much more recently, and I think much more plausibly, has argued that that really wasn't the case, that George III did come to the throne with a set of intentions, a set of views, a set of ideas, and that he was determined to carry them out through if he could. George wanted to put an end to what he called the unhappy distinction of parties. He didn't like the notion of political parties, and he wanted to put in his own favourite to help put an end to those two unhappy distinctions of parties, or repute. And George took the view, as we all, I think, know, that the prime loyalty of ministers must be to him, that they were responsible to him first and foremost, and only to Parliament secondarily. George famously said, "He who speaks against your repute speaks against me," thereby conflating his own royal persona with that of his first minister. And George's intervention in politics in this way, against the customs of parties, against the custom of ministerial responsibility primarily to Parliament, not to the monarch, resulted in what was in some senses in the 1760s, back to my undergraduate essay question, a breakdown in the system and functioning of politics, and generated the huge instability of the 1760s as administrations came and went with extraordinary speed and rapidity. That in turn led, of course, in the 1760s to the Whig critique of George III as an overbearing and interfering monarch who didn't understand the doctrine of ministerial responsibility to the Commons. All this, of course, put by Edmund Burke in his thoughts on the causes of the present discontents, and who sought to assert the monarchy and in politics to a great degree that was then thought to be either customary or appropriate or traditional. And that was then, of course, followed in the 1770s by the American critique of George III as a tyrant suppressing the liberties of colonists, denounced and excoriated in the Declaration of Independence, of course, as a tyrant. It has to be said that all the founding documents of any great nation, the Declaration of Independence does contain more historical inaccuracies than almost any other. Because in truth, both with regard to the 1760s and the 1770s, George was not being unconstitutional, not least, of course, because that term and that concept didn't even exist then. George didn't do anything that, as it were, transgressed certainly such limiting rules of constitutional arrangement as there were, even if he transgressed some of the conventions that had perhaps come into being by the 1760s that he ought to have taken notice of. It's certainly the case, I think, that in that decade, but also to some degree later on as well, he was either ignorant of or hostile to the concept of ministerial responsibility being primarily to Parliament rather than to him, but to take that view, as I've said, wasn't necessarily unconstitutional. As for the American colonists, they were just wrong. George III was not a tyrant seeking to repress colonial liberties. He saw himself, on the contrary, as fighting the battle of the legislature and supporting parliamentary sovereignty over and against the colonists, not asserting royal sovereignty or royal tyranny. He was seeking to uphold the sovereignty of Parliament. So all of that was kind of a mess, really, in the 1760s and 1770s, from the standpoint of the monarch, let alone the concept of constitutional monarchy. It's clearly the case that there were times during that period when George III was coerced and when politicians got their way in a manner that was not satisfactory or happy to him. The creation of Rockingham's ministry, Grenville's ministry, Shelburne's ministry, and above all the Foxworth coalition would all be examples of the politicians getting their way despite the opposition of the king, and the king being compelled to appoint ministers whom ideally he did not wish to appoint at all. On the other hand, there were times when George III didn't get his way, certainly with the appointment of Bute in 1760, certainly with the appointment of Lord North, certainly bringing down the Foxcroft coalition, certainly appointing William Pitt the Younger and sustaining him in office for a very long time, and certainly insisting that Catholic emancipation could not be passed while he was king. Pitt the Younger, remember, resigns rather than try to carry Catholic emancipation against the wishes and the will of the monarch. So that's, as it were, the battle being fought out between a notion of the sovereignty of Parliament and, in a sense, a notion of the royal prerogative and royal power and royal rights. Now, in the long run, at least in retrospect, the way of the future was that the monarch had to give way on ministerial appointments, give way on policy, and, in a sense, leave things to Parliament and later on to the electorate. Lord North, at the end of his period as First Minister, famously told George III that Parliament's sentiments must ultimately prevail, and that the monarch, that's to say George, must yield at length, as some of the most renowned and most glorious of your predecessors have done, to the opinion and wishes of the House of Commons. And that yielding is, in some senses, what we would now understand by the term constitutional monarchy. But that was certainly not George III's view of how things ought to function, and it was certainly not how things always did function during his reign. And in the case of George's two successors, there were continued royal protests at what was thought to be the improper attempt to coerce policies or politicians that the monarch themselves didn't want. George IV, for example, was deeply hostile to the Liberal Tory administration and was much dismayed when they were determined to carry Catholic emancipation against his wishes and, as he saw it, against the terms of his coronation oath. His successor, William IV, was an even more interfering monarch than George IV had been. He dismissed the ministry 3 times and he dissolved the Parliament twice, and felt it was entirely appropriate for the monarch to intervene in the affairs of the legislature in that intrusive and assertive and aggressive way. It's important also to remember, with regard to George III and George IV and of course William, as with George III and George II, that not only were they monarchs of Great Britain, they were also electors of Hanover. And the way they behaved as electors of Hanover is often entirely sealed off from their performance as monarchs in Britain. But we do need to remember that as electors of Hanover, they did exercise far more direct power than they did as kings of Britain. And maybe that influenced their rather grand notions, it might now seem to us, as to what their powers ought to be here in Britain itself. In any event, what this means is that by the time Queen Victoria acceded to the throne, the powers of the monarch and relations between the monarch and politicians were still vaguely ambiguous in 1837, even though the term constitutional monarch was in use by then. Well, let me now have a look at Victoria's reign, 1837 to 1901, but one of the great distortions of Queen Victoria is that precisely because she was around for so long, she gives a unity to a period which in many ways is astonishingly varied and different and transforming across the 64 years of her reign, and that's as true of the monarchy itself as of many other things too. There really was no such thing as the Victorian age, except that Victoria was always there. It's in Victoria's reign that the concept of constitutional monarchy comes to be very much recognised. And it's recognised as something that's seen as a break with the Hanoverian past. She and Albert often seen as the pioneers of constitutional monarchy, by which was meant the crown above party and displaying a certain degree of political neutrality. As claimed by Macaulay in the 1850s, as it seems claimed by Albert, here's Albert writing to Baron Stockmar in 1852, constitutional monarchy marches unassailably on its beneficent course. And of course, most famously in the 1860s, as set out by Walter Bagehot in the pages of the English Constitution, where he famously observed that the British monarchy, as a constitutional monarchy, had 3 rights: to encourage, to be consulted, and to warn. And there we have it, so it seems, in the history of Macaulay, in the practice of Victoria and Albert, and in the rationalisation and analysis of Walter Bagehot, the founding documents and precedents of constitutional monarchy, as we now understand it. But in fact, of course, the story isn't anything like as simple or as straightforward as that. Victoria, on her accession, having been born brought up here, was a very opinionated and determined monarch, and why not on the basis of the previous behaviour of her predecessors as monarchs, and her opinionated and determined manner, of course, famously on display very soon after she became Queen in the bedchamber crisis of 1839, when she refused to accept Peel's nominations as the ladies of the bedchamber and successfully prolonged the life of Lord Belmore's administration, to which, both politically and personally, she was much ready and devoted. She was very partisan as a young monarch, pro-Melbourne and anti-Peel, and very assertive of the rights of the monarch herself. Now, it's important to notice that in many ways Albert did not attenuate these prejudices and this assertive notion of the powers of the monarch, but in a sense reinforced them and redefined them and rationalised them in a way that I think is often inadequately appreciated. What did Albert mean when he said constitutional monarchy marches unassailable on its beneficent cause? What sense of constitutional monarchy did he have? Well, the answer, I think, is not the sense that Walter Bagehot had to have. He had a very strong and very positive concept of what monarchy should do and of what monarchy ought to do, and of course, again, that's no surprise because he is another German princeling, and on the whole, German princelings took a more authoritarian and aggressive view of the prerogatives of royalty than perhaps their English counterparts might have done. Albert saw monarchy, saw the British monarchy as being central to the process of government. He thought that monarchy was concerned about the good of the country as a whole and the long-term interest of the nation as a whole, which of course was why he, like Sir Peel, who took a very similar view of things. He did not think parties were a good idea because he thought that they drove the people to extremes and that they were only interested in short-term calculation. And he saw the monarchy as being a corrective to the extremism and short-termism of government. More to the point still, he saw himself as Prince Consort, as Victoria's sole confidential advisor, as the Queen's private secretary and her permanent minister, and all that set out in the letter to Albert from the 1840s. Albert, of course, worked furiously hard, overseeing, as he saw it, government business, and saw all major cabinet papers, and sought to be involved in cabinet discussion of policy, not just to be told what decisions had been reached. He saw his job, or rather he saw Victoria's job as interpreted by him, as being to watch and control ministers, those are Albert's words again, to share in cabinet decisions, to recommend and veto all cabinet appointments, and to play a particularly important part in the formulation of foreign policy, not via the Foreign Secretary, but by corresponding with other European monarchs to whom, of course, Albert was related. And the reason that Victoria and Albert fell out so much with Palmerston was because their view was that they should be doing foreign policy, not he. So notice then that Albert believed in a very exalted concept of the royal prerogative. Certainly not just what Walter Bagehot thought. That helps explain why Victoria and Albert Dreaming effectively sacked Palmerston in 1851 and effectively fixed up the Aberdeen coalition in 1853 and indeed chose most of Aberdeen's cabinet for him. Monarchy, as Albert and Victoria saw it, was essential to the Constitution. Without an aggressive, assertive, intrusive, involved, engaged monarchy, the political process simply was incomplete and wouldn't work properly. And if you want two notions as to the part played by the monarchy in the mid-19th century Constitution, which are rather different from Bagehot's, I have to say. One way of doing so is have a look at the Palace of Westminster. Somebody might say the British Constitution is unwritten, but it is not unbuilt. And the Palace of Westminster, in a sense, is one version of how the British Constitution was conceived at the time when it was rebuilt in the 1840s and 50s. And of course, the most grandiose part of the Palace of Westminster is the royal part. The second most grandiose part is the House of Lords, and the really utterly underdecorated bit is the House of Commons. And if you want a sense, not our normal sense, of, as it were, the relative standing within the British Constitution of those three elements, go and look at the Palace of Westminster. It is not only extraordinary architecture, but as a vision, a version of the British Constitution, it's also extraordinary, not least because its version of the British Constitution is very much Albert's notion of how important monarchy was. If you want a second notion of how important Albert and Victoria thought the role of monarchy in Britain was, then consider the educational system which they devised for the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. Remember that it was an educational system of extraordinary intellectual and academic rigour, to which, of course, the poor Prince of Wales was temperamentally and intellectually completely unsuited, and against which he rebelled very vehemently. But the case for seeking to educate the next monarch, as the elder son will be, to become some sort of philosopher king, to know an enormous amount about history, economics, political economy, literature, philosophy, was because it was expected that his job as a monarch would be a very demanding one, in exactly the way that Albert had defined it and was practicing it, and that you could not possibly hope to carry off that extraordinarily assertive notion of the significance of monarchy if you hadn't been properly educated into the job. The history of the young and future Edward VII's education is normally only talked about in terms of his own rather unhappy childhood. But the most important way to think about it is that, in a sense, it's another version of exactly what Albert, and through him Victoria, thought the job and the powers and the importance of the monarchy actually was. Let me think about that in another way very briefly. What would have happened if Albert hadn't died in 1861? What would have happened? What would have happened if Albert and Victoria, as it were, reigned jointly, which was effectively what was going on, through until 1901? Suppose Albert had lived as long as Prince Philip. Or what would have happened if Victoria had died in 1861 instead of Albert? And there would then have been a joint monarchy of Prince Albert and Edward VII. What would have happened under either of those alternative circumstances, which might quite easily have attained? I think the answer is that things would have been very difficult. And I think that I will be giving a very different lecture today from the one that, in fact, I am giving. Because I think it's absolutely clear that Albert would have held out in the 1860s, 70s, 80s and 90s for a much stronger role for the monarch than in the end Victoria was able to do. And I think that the friction between Albert and the politicians might have become very serious indeed. I think it's also the case that Albert might well have preferred Gladstone to Disraeli in the 1860s, 70s and 80s. In that case, the history of Britain in the 19th century and indeed of the British Empire would have been very different from how it actually turned out. So Albert is hugely important in the history of the evolution, or in my view about his period, non-evolution of the British monarchy towards a constitutional monarchy. And that, I think, because of the grand sense of the royal prerogative, of royal powers, and of the part the monarchy should play in government that Albert had, helps make sense, I think, of what is often regarded, this is Disraeli's observation that Albert dies, as a kind of characteristically epigrammatical but not very straightforward observation by Disraeli. Disraeli said, had Albert lived, he would have given Britain the blessings of absolute government while retaining all constitutional guarantees. People have often said that's a completely incomprehensible piece of Disraelian witticism. That's what he told me, Victoria, I had the blank page between the Old Testament and the New, that it was sort of clever, but it didn't mean anything. But in the context of what I've just been saying about Albert, it seems to me, in fact, to make a lot of sense. Well, 6 years after Albert died, Walter Bagehot, of course, produced his celebrated book, The English Constitution. And in that there is, of course, the chapter on monarchy, in which he offered his account of how things had recently been and maybe how things were. And, of course, he frequently uses the phrase constitution, monarchy. The beginning of wisdom about Bagehot, beyond, of course, admiring the wonderfully silken and honeyed and memorable phrases that have, as it were, oozed their way down the centuries and are still quoted even today, the beginning of wisdom about Bagehot is that it's terribly confused, and it isn't consistent, and it isn't straightforward, and there are very good historical reasons why that's so. Bagehot can't really make up his mind what the British monarch does and how powerful it is, and unless one starts with that presumption, Bagehot doesn't make sense. It's certainly true that he thinks the British monarch in the 1860s less powerful than its predecessors. The old Constitution of England, he writes, undoubtedly gave a sort of power to the crown which our present Constitution does not give. That's one of Bagehot's arguments. And here's another of Badger's lines which seems very straightforward. It is only during the period of the present reign that the duties of the constitutional sovereign have ever been well performed. Well, that's exactly mimicking and replicating Macaulay. And of course, it's Bagehot, the journalist, the editor of The Economist, who famously sets out what he thinks a constitutional monarch can do, should do, ought to do. A sovereign has, under a constitutional monarchy such as ours, 3 rights: the right to be consulted, the right to be encouraged, and the right to war. And he goes on, a king of great sense and sagacity would want no others. And that, of course, is the basis for Bagehot's celebrated distinction between the dignified and the efficient parts of the Constitution, the monarchy along with the House of Lords, of course, forming the dignified part of the Constitution. And it also underlies Bagehot's observation that the crown is of no party. So that's Bagehot, the famous 3 rights that he essentially, as a journalist, made up. Bagehot's notion that that's all you need if you're a constitutional monarch. Bagehot's notion that the monarchy is dignified but not efficient, not therefore engaged in the process of government, and it's a good party. Well, is that right? Is that what had been going on in the recent times from which Bagehot was drawing most of his historical material? I think the answer to that, particularly in the light of what I just said about Albert, has to be no. It seems to me that that was far too passive and restricted a notion of what the royal powers were. It certainly wasn't an accurate description of the rights that Victoria and Albert claimed and what they did or didn't do. They certainly insisted, as the words of Albert I already quoted suggest, that their rights and powers were a great deal more. And this is my point about Bagehot being confused. It's also clear that although Bagehot, as it were, sets this out as being how a constitutional monarchy should behave, he's also clear that actually in recent times it hasn't quite been like that. One of his most famous phrases, often disregarded but rather important, the crown does more than it seems. A phrase by terms wonderfully knowing yet wonderfully vague, but one I think that we shouldn't disregard, certainly one that Lord Palmerston and Lord Cannadine would heartily but not very happily have endorsed. The Queen has a certain control over the cabinet, is also what Bagehot writes. It is known too to everyone conversant with the real course of the recent history of England that Prince Albert did gain great power. Well, that doesn't square with the 3 rights that he's set out either. The fact, Bagehot goes on, will be known to our children's children, but not to us. So it's very important to notice that Bagehot, indeed I suspect like most contemporaries, had a kind of sense, not always well documented, but it was a good instinct, that the crown was indeed doing more than it seemed, and that the role of monarchy in practice, in reality, certainly as carried on by Victoria and by Albert, was much more than those 3 rights which he set out. In other words, it's a mistake, I think, to see Bagehot's famous 3 rights as a description of what Victoria and Albert were actually doing, just as I think it's a mistake to see them on the back of that as inventing the subsequent practice of constitutional monarchy as we now understand it. Far from being accurately descriptive, Bagehot is, as it were, inadvertently prescriptive, as monarchy evolves or attenuates in the 20th century into something much more akin to Bagehot's formulation. But as an account of how things were in Bagehot's time, it actually is in many ways, I think, very misleading. Well, what then happens in the rest of Victoria's reign post-Bagehot, if I may put it that way? Disraeli, of course, the arch-flatterer, constantly flattered Queen Victoria about how important she was. The course of the ministry depends upon the will of the Queen, he told Victoria, but you can see why she would like that in the light of what I've been talking about earlier. Notice also that the passing of the Imperial Titles Act in 1876 was hugely controversial, much debated discussion about the royal prerogative, much debated discussion about seeming to import ideas of Oriental despotism into the British monarchy, which was not thought to be a good idea. But also notice, and this is where I think the death of Albert is more important than has often been appreciated. It's not merely that Albert, who provided much of the intellectual engine power for this more assertive notion of monarchy, it's not merely that that goes when Albert dies, true though that was. It's also that such residual royal power as the monarchy had lessons as parties solidified and as the electorate became more important, and in a sense as Parliament became less important in making and unmaking ministries. So in 1880, for example, the Queen could neither keep Disraeli in office, though she would love to do so, nor keep the vile Gladstone, as she saw him, out once the electorate had spoken. There was nothing she could do about that. Nevertheless, it is important to notice that Queen Victoria constantly insisted to the end of her reign she cannot and will not be the Queen of a democratic monarchy. That was not an idea that appealed to her at all. And of course, she was very partisan and very hostile to Gladstone. The Queen is enough to kill any man, Gladstone once observed in desperation, berating from the Queen. He feared that she might actually turn one of his governments out, and he was determined to carry her rule for Ireland, to which, of course, the Queen was viscerally hostile. And it's certainly true that the Queen intrigued with Lord Salisbury on more than one occasion to undermine Gladstone's third and fourth government. In the end, I don't think, as it were, that had much decisive impact because the opinion of the country as a whole was against her rule. But there isn't any doubt that Victoria interfered far more to try to undermine Gladstone in the 1880s and the 1890s. It was consistent with what Walter Bagehot said how a constitutional monarch should behave. It's also, I think, important to notice then that Queen Victoria regretted the loss of power and the growth of pomp. She regretted, I think, that by the end of her reign, she had less power than perhaps she had had at the beginning of her reign, and certainly than that she had wielded with all the intellectual, as it were, firepower and support during the time that she had been married to Albert. She thought the crown should be fundamental rather than ornamental, and that it should be efficient rather than dignified. The evolution at the end of her reign of a monarchy that was less politically powerful and more publicly grandiose was not, in fact, the outcome that either she or Albert would necessarily have wanted. And if that's constitutional monarchy, I think it's important to notice that that would not have been an outcome that gave her pleasure or happiness at all. Well, let me now turn to the period since 1901, noting though the enormous transformations in Victoria's reign. It's clear that since 1901, things, as it were, have changed, and Bagehot, hitherto prescriptive, now becomes, in a sense, descriptive. George V, George V, George VI, and Queen Elizabeth II were all brought up on Bagehot. They were all told, as it were, that if you wanted to be a constitutional monarch, you had to read Bagehot. And they sort of read Bagehot while they were having their cornflakes at breakfast. Learned to be a constitutional monarch. This, of course, is completely ridiculous, partly because Bagehot had no idea really what a constitutional monarch was. He was very confused, and if you read Bagehot carefully, you can draw no general conclusions as to how you should behave at all. So they probably just have underlined the bit about the three rights and read that and then went back to the cornflakes instead. Nevertheless, Bagehot becomes the kind of textbook. Teach yourself how to be a constitutional monarch. These rights are made up by journalists. That's the kind of bedrock for Britain of constitutional monarchy. It's pretty bizarre when you come to think of it, but that's, as it were, how things are. What Bagehot said at the Leveson inquiry, one can't begin to imagine. The whole notion, in the sense that the basis of the theory and the practice of the British monarchy is a piece written by a journalist, is really, I think, very extraordinary. It's also, of course, important to notice that Britain has increasingly become a democracy from 1918 onwards, but it wasn't really a democracy before 1918, with the passing of the 44 Act, which finally became one. The Crown, since then, I think, has been, at least in terms of its official function, above the political battle, whatever the personal opinions of the sovereigns might be. Monarchs in the 20th century haven't interfered in politics in the way that Victoria, even towards the end of her reign, sought to do against Gladstone. They act on the advice of government, and they are publicly neutral in their opinions. And on the whole, they leave it to the electorate to decide, as it were, which party is going to be in power, and off the back of that, who in practice is going to be Prime Minister. It may still be the royal prerogative to appoint the Prime Minister, but the person to be appointed, whereby it's clear who the monarch should appoint as Prime Minister, takes place elsewhere. And instead of, as it were, this earlier period of partisanship, what has happened is that the monarchy has gradually evolved to being the kind of impartial referee who brings the parties together. That still pays homage, I think, to this notion that parties represent extreme opinions, but it does so in a rather different way. This is the monarchy above party, not to interfere in politics, but to bring the parties together. Foreshadowed, I think, in the mid-1880s, at the time of the passing of the Third Reform Act, this did become a very important matter, especially in the reign of George V, when he brings together the parties to try to arrange a compromise during the crisis over the People's Budget leading up to the passing of the Parliament Act, during the Ulster crisis immediately before the First World War, and during the creation of the national government in 1951. That's the monarch as conciliator, the monarch as referee, the monarch above parties trying to bring everybody together. A world, as Ross McKibben has described it, a world of pomp and fairness embodied in this new and rather different articulation of constitutional monarchy. What that's left, though perhaps no more, but for much of the 20th century, is also the job of appointing the Prime Minister on the occasions when, as it were, the electorate isn't clear or when it's not left to the electorate at all. As in 1916, Lloyd Asquith and then Lloyd George, as in 1923, when George V had to choose between Baldwin and Curzon, as in 1940 with Churchill and Halifax, as in 1957 with Al Langdon and Graham Butler, and as in 1963 with Alec Douglas Hume and Graham Butler. The monarch really did have to make some sort of choice on those occasions. Some criticism in each case of the monarchy, though Vernon Baltimore was looked into this, things on the whole, the Crown got it right. And it's certainly true that on some of these occasions, the monarchs had their own views. It's one of the things that's often been conveniently forgotten, classically in the case of the film The King's Speech recently, that George VI in 1940 and Queen Elizabeth loathed Churchill. Don't believe anything about those final scenes in The King's Speech, which are completely wrong. They loathed Churchill because, of course, he had been a supporter of Edward VIII and the Duchess of Windsor, as she subsequently became. They loathed Churchill because he was a critic of appeasement, and they absolutely did not want Churchill to be Prime Minister in 1940. They wanted Halifax. Unfortunately, George VI was not able to get his way, and in the end was willing to do as he was told. By the same token, in 1945, by which time relations were much better, George VI was deeply dismayed that Churchill was thrown out by the electorate, but there wasn't anything he could do about that either. So the monarchy has been important in that on those occasions it was up to the monarch to appoint the Prime Minister, because there was no other process whereby that could be done. On each occasion they probably got it right, but in certain cases there can be no doubt they got it right on the basis of suppressing their own personal preferences, which is of course what constitutional monarchs are indeed supposed to do, but certainly wasn't what Victoria and Albert thought they ought to do. Since, of course, the 1960s, the Conservative Party now chooses its own leader, just as the Labour Party does, and therefore the scope on the whole for the monarch even to have to do things like this has been much less. What is more, since there is no proportional representation in this country, and there doesn't seem to be likely to be proportional representation anytime soon, there is usually, not always, but usually a clear majority in the first past the post system, so there's far less for the monarch to do than in other countries that do have PR and where coalitions are much more the norm. There is much more work for monarchs in, for example, Belgium and in Holland to do to try to get coalitions put together. Remember, Belgium went for several months without a coalition government because they couldn't be political priorities urged upon politicians like I said, then Secretary for the Cabinet, who produced a very large briefing document about what to do under the circumstances that did indeed come out as a result of the unclear verdict of the 2010 election. And there were two aims. One was to do something rapidly so the markets wouldn't get upset. The other was to keep the Crown out of any political controversy. And those were the two highest priorities in terms of what had to be done to fix up a deal which wouldn't upset the markets by taking forever and which wouldn't drag the monarchy into controversy and involve the monarchy in the process whereby in the end the Canon coalition was fixed up. So it's important to notice that in fact it was all fixed up by the politicians between themselves and like I said, and it was only after that that the monarch summoned Cameron to the palace. There was no criticism of the Crown whatsoever, unlike 1957 or the war 1963. So what we are left with, it seems to me, and here of course we move into hugely intriguing territory, is that leaving aside, because it's not as important as it used to be, the monarch's formal involvement in the appointment of Prime Minister. Leaving all that aside, what we are actually left with is that the way constitutional monarchy most works, and probably has for most of the 20th century in a way, is on the basis of the weekly royal audiences between the monarch and the Prime Minister. And we would suppose that it's at those audiences that the monarch does exert or put into practice the three constitutional rights that Walter Bagehot sketched out back in the 1860s. That is where, more than anywhere else, constitutional monarchy does no doubt function. And of course, the brutal truth is that we are never going to know how that works or what actually goes on, because that's just about the only thing in government that doesn't leak at the time, and it's just about the only thing in government of which there is no written record. So it's an intriguing irony in a way that constitutional monarchy, which is in many ways thought to be an entirely appropriate model for a modern, up-to-date democratic society, depends for its essential function on a series of conversations which are utterly confidential and completely, in that sense, to use one of our buzzwords, without transparency. We simply don't know what goes on. And the history of constitutional monarchy in the 20th century will primarily be a history of diary engagements of the Queen and the Prime Minister, but we will not know what went on. Well, that's a very rapid canter across some of the centuries where the issue of what is or isn't a constitutional monarchy, as it were, matter, certainly not all of them, but perhaps enough to get on with to get us started off. I must repeat this strange paradox that since Britain has no written constitution, there's a sense in which any form of monarchy would be constitutional, because how could it be deemed not to be? It's also quite important to notice that although we tend to associate constitutional monarchy with limited monarchy, with a monarchy that reigns but does not rule, many authoritarian monarchies actually have been constitutional. Meiji Japan had a constitution which prescribed very considerable powers for the Japanese emperor, and that was not surprising because that constitution was based on the written constitution of Hohenzollern Germany, of which the same was true. Nevertheless, it's generally the case that by constitutional monarchy we mean something much more circumscribed in its power and something a bit more specific about where it came into being. But to go back to my questions, when exactly did Britain become a constitutional monarchy? The truth is that it's very difficult to pinpoint any single moment at which that is. If we ask the question, who wanted this to happen? On the whole, it's fair to say that politicians wanted more power for the legislature and the cabinet and less power for the monarch. And if we ask ourselves who are the people who most regretted this outcome, it would be fair to say that constitutional monarchy as now practiced was not the outcome that George III, George IV, William IV, or Queen Victoria would have wanted. Each one of them wished to preserve royal powers as they understood them and to hand them on unimpeded, unimpaired, and undiminished to their successors. And if we look at what the powers of the British monarchy are now, I think they are nothing like as great as them. Two final thoughts, if I may, and then we can get to lunch and get on to the serious business this afternoon. Monarchy, as it were, generically, historically, and anthropologically understood, is a male concept. Remember that the king of the jungle is Tarzan, not Jane, if that's what interests you. It's a lion, not a lioness. Monarchy is generically male. Monarchs are supposed to be warriors, leaders, lawgivers, governors, among other things, but especially those. And one of the ways of thinking about constitutional monarchy is that it's in many ways the giving up of those male functions of monarchy. And the right to warn, the right to be consulted, the right to encourage might perhaps be thought of, this is in quotation marks, I'm not sure I agree with this, but it's a way of thinking about it, might be thought of as rather more feminine attributes than leading the troops into battle. There is a case that constitutional monarchy is a feminized or emasculated version of the generically male version of monarchy. And it is, of course, it's just a coincidence, because this is the way that life and death and succession works out, but it is interesting that that may part explain why Victoria is often held up as the prototypical constitutional monarch, when I don't actually think she was, and why the present Queen can certainly be held up as a genuinely successful constitutional monarch of the Council. She certainly is. We shouldn't be too broken about this if, of course, you want to look at the most extraordinary example of feminized, matriarchal constitutional monarchy, then look at the Netherlands, where a a succession of women who were sovereign. Very interesting. Or if you want a British version, there is that wonderfully moving and haunting picture when George VI's coffin is unloaded from the train that's brought his body from Sandringham in London, and there is Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, and the new Queen Elizabeth II. There is matriarchal monarchy in mourning, as it were, in excelsis. Men are not good, this is what I'm saying, at being, as it were, confined monarchs, because they expect to be doing all the male things which as a constitutional monarch, on the whole, you can't. A final thought here. Yesterday morning, I got off the ship at Southampton in order to be taken to the studio to talk a bit about the Diamond Jubilee. The ship I got off was the Queen Mary II at Southampton. I spent 7 days in pampered luxury, which I thought was essential preparation for the cruise. And at Southampton was to be seen the Queen Mary II and, uniquely apparently ever, the other two Cunard liners, the Queen Victoria and the new Queen Elizabeth. And all three were there, the first time they'd ever been seen in European pictures together, and the last. And it prompted, as I watched this very extraordinary sight, I have to say, one or two thoughts in relation to this conference and indeed to bringing this lecture to a close. One of which, of course, is that there again is the image of matriarchal monarchy. It's Queen Victoria, it's Queen Mary, it's Queen Elizabeth. It's not Prince Albert, it's not George V, and it's not the Duke of Edinburgh. There is a sort of maritime version of matriarchal feminine monarchy. I was also struck by the fact that this is often seen as the very embodiment of British national identity and greatness, and yet, of course, the tradition of naming ships after British queens in its modern guise only goes back to the 1930s, when the first Queen Elizabeth and the first Queen Mary were launched. And I was also struck by the fact that though these ships may be seen as the embodiment of national identity, as articulated by a feminised and matriarchal monarchy, not one of these ships was built in Britain, and Cunard is now owned by a company that's based in America. Circumstances that would have been at best unthinkable and at worst intolerable only 60 years ago in 1952, when the Queen came to the throne. So, I suppose what I'm trying to say by quoting that anecdote at the end is that it's a reminder of the many different ways in which now, as in earlier times, monarchy intrudes itself into our lives, into our consciousness, into our historical consciousness, as it were, supporting that, or on occasions distorting it, far beyond the narrow specifics of is this a constitutional act or isn't it. Constitutional monarchy is very important. It's a very important element in the history of monarchy, as I've tried to demonstrate this morning. But as I've also tried to demonstrate this morning, there is a great deal more to monarchy than that. In that sense, we can agree with Bagehot. The Crown does more than it seems. And it seems to me very fitting and very appropriate that so much of this conference that is to come is thinking about monarchy in this much broader and more imaginative way. And I'm sure that the rest of